The 1990s were tumultuous for the web, from its inception to its explosive growth, and then the fragmentation that nearly ruined it for everyone. But now you also know about the story about how in parallel, the W3C stood up and stepped in and somehow convinced everyone, including the heavy hitters, to play by a set of rules called standards, all under the watchful eye of the W3C. And then late in that decade, we talked about in the last lecture, an interesting development came about, JavaScript. And even though it got off to a kind of a rough start, like so many things having to do with the web, again, it all worked out because those major players decided to work together and abide by a set of standards. So going into the new millennium, the future for the web looked pretty bright. But not everyone's happy about how things are going because the W3C, once a symbol of collaboration and progress, starts to feel like they're working in slow motion, rigid, and out of touch with how people actually use the web. So, how did we get to this point? Because if you remember, as soon as everyday people, which included myself, started stumbling onto Marc Andreessen's version of the web, we immediately began thinking of it in terms of business opportunities and opportunities for everyday people and just plain fun. And remember, there were business ventures like the fledgling Netscape Communications Company and then tech giants like Microsoft that were more than willing to seize on our fascination of the web by supporting whatever we liked about it at that time, even if it meant ignoring the warnings from its original inventor, Tim Berners-Lee. So what went wrong? Well, the W3C was built around a formal committee-based process, and the design specs were developed slowly and carefully, but for developers and browser vendors who were trying to move fast and solve real problems, well, it was frustrating. And the realities of commerce and the fickle nature of the public stayed in complete opposition to the W3C's slow and methodical approach. So now consider the timeline. With Netscape, the people who brought us the image tag did it again, making their own way with JavaScript. And as we talked about before in the last lecture, the success of that push was mostly due to the unexpected collaboration with Microsoft, which was brokered by the ECMA International folks in 1997. And with that success, well, that left the W3C on the outside, taking less of a leadership role in what was basically one of the most important developments in web history. So the W3C was left out in the periphery, more in a supporting role than a leader. And that, browser vendors working together and around the W3C gave us a model for what came next. There were lots of criticisms of the W3C, and some were for pretty good reason, and some of them were unfounded. But since its inception, the mission was always built on good intentions. So even though there was some pushback from time to time, all in all, the recommendations that came from the W3C were, at the very least, directionally correct. But perhaps the beginning of the end started in January 2000, when the W3C, in its infinite wisdom, recommended the next step in the hypertext markup language. Actually, it wasn't even HTML. It was something called XHTML, version 1.0. The X stood for XML. And by the way, this recommendation from the W3C's working groups came out pretty much at the same time as its other recommendation, HTML without the X, version 4.01. And we'll talk about what XML is and the W3C's fascination with it in a moment. But first, the idea was that the W3C would promote both the traditional, more forgiving standard of HTML, while in parallel pushing this new, stricter XML-based version that was more machine-readable and easier to validate and transform, all for the lofty goal of making the web more aligned with emerging ideas about data interoperability, which was a noble cause, but not exactly what web developers and browser makers needed at that particular moment. So, remember the joke, not a joke, about standards, about how there are so many of them, because Ironically, the confusion this time was being caused by the very institution that was charged with being the bearer of web standards. So now there were two web standards, and what was software engineers supposed to do? What were we web developers supposed to do? Anyway, about XML. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, which was designed for structured data exchange between systems. And it enforced rules like this thing called well-formedness and strict nesting of tags. But XML was just another markup language. And by the way, remember that Tim Berners-Lee pulled together 3 existing technologies to create the web. One of them was structured documents using a markup language. So he didn't invent that, he just created his own version because it was IBM that came up with the concept. And that led to a lot of other markup languages being created for various purposes. TBL simply built on that to create HTML. And XML was another language that grew up in parallel with HTML and had nothing to do with the web originally. So anyway, the hope from the W3C was that if HTML followed the design and purpose of XML, web documents would become easier to process, easier to validate and transform across platforms, especially for automated systems and future use cases like syndication and mobile rendering and even accessibility. The idea was to treat the web more like a data environment and less like a forgiving publishing system. And that made sense for machine readability and consistency, but it clashed with how real-world developers worked. Ironically, XML's well-formed or die mindset made the web more fragile and less accessible to working developers who had come to expect that the browser would recover from small mistakes. And to make matters worse, the growing list of doc types and incompatibilities between XHTML and traditional HTML caused confusion for developers who were just trying to do the right thing. So, it all came to a head in 2004 because Apple was throwing its hat into the ring with its Safari web browser right around this time. And as a relatively late entrant into this battle of wills, they were looking at what the W3C was doing with fresh eyes. So Apple formed an alliance with the Mozilla project, the creators of Firefox, along with the people maintaining the Opera web browser. And they formed their own version of the W3C, and they called it, with the sexy name, Web Hypertext Application Technologies Working Group, which formed an acronym WHATWG, pronounced WHATWG. It was a practical, developer-focused alternative to the W3C. And that's when things got really interesting.